Expelled as a thief before her wedding. 5 years later, the Earl discovered the truth and begged forgiveness. Before we begin this beautiful period romance story, tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I love knowing where you're joining us from. And subscribe if you love romantic stories like this. Now, let's fall into this tale together. Yorkshire, England, 1815. In the grand drawing room of Thornfield Estate, crystal chandeliers cast trembling light across the assembled faces of high society. Helena Ravencrest stood before them all, perfectly still, despite the terror coursing through her veins. Every eye was fixed upon her, every breath held in terrible anticipation. In Countess Margaret's outstretched hands lay a ruby ring, deep red as fresh blood, set in gold, that caught the candlelight and threw it back in mocking flashes. It had belonged to Nathaniel's mother, passed down through 5 generations of Thornfield women, a family treasure beyond price, and they had found it hidden among Helena's belongings. "We discovered this concealed in your book, Miss Ravencrest." The Countess's voice was cold as winter steel. "The book you carry with you always, hidden between the pages where you thought no one would look." The silence that followed was suffocating. 100 pairs of eyes boring into her, whispers beginning to spread like poison through water, and then came the voice that shattered what remained of her world. "Helena, how could you?" Nathaniel Thornfield stood across the room, his face a portrait of betrayal. Those grey eyes that had looked at her with such tenderness mere hours ago now held only disbelief, disappointment, the crushing weight of a trust destroyed. But Helena had stolen nothing. She was innocent, and not a single soul believed her. This is the story of how a single lie destroyed 2 lives, how desperation and jealousy conspired to tear apart something that should have been beautiful, and how, sometimes, the path to forgiveness is longer and more painful than anyone could have imagined. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from. It's a pleasure to know how far our stories reach. If you enjoy narratives of quiet strength, loyalty tested beyond endurance, and love that refuses to die even in the darkest moments, please subscribe and leave your like. And tell me, have you ever been accused of something you didn't do? Do you know what it's like to have your word stand alone against the entire world? Leave your answer in the comments. 2 years before that terrible night, Helena Ravencrest arrived at Thornfield Estate as companion to the Dowager Countess. She was 22 years old, the orphaned daughter of a respected vicar who had died leaving behind nothing but debts, and a daughter educated far beyond her station, too refined to marry a tradesman, too poor to attract a gentleman. The mathematics of her situation were brutally simple. She had 3 choices, and none of them good. She could marry for convenience, accept some merchant willing to overlook her lack of dowry in exchange for her educated manners and respectable name. She could become a governess, condemned to that peculiar purgatory between servant and family, belonging to neither world, or she could accept the position as lady's companion. She chose the last. At least it offered a roof over her head, regular meals, and the dignity of serving a woman of standing rather than being treated as little more than a piece of furniture in someone else's home. Countess Margaret of Thornfield was 65, widowed for a decade, and ruled her household with an iron fist wrapped in silk gloves. She was fair but inflexible, kind within the rigid boundaries of propriety, and utterly unforgiving of anything that might threaten the family's reputation. "Miss Ravencrest," she said during their first meeting, studying Helena with shrewd eyes that missed nothing, "your duties are straightforward. You will read to me when my eyes tire, keep me company during meals, accompany me on social visits, and, above all, remain discreet, respectable, and invisible when the situation requires it. This house has maintained an impeccable reputation for 200 years. I expect you to help preserve that legacy," Helena agreed, and for 2 years she lived exactly as expected, discreet, respectable, nearly invisible, until the spring of 1813 when Nathaniel Thornfield came home. Nathaniel was 30 years old, with the bearing of a man who had seen more of the world than most would in several lifetimes, broad-shouldered from years of work that had nothing to do with the leisured life of most aristocrats, a face weathered by sun and experience, dark eyes that seemed to carry the weight of memories he rarely shared. He was the Countess's nephew, son of the late Earl's younger brother, and the direct heir to the title and estates. He had spent the past 5 years working as a colonial administrator in India, returning only because his aunt, who had no children of her own, insisted it was time for him to assume his responsibilities as the future Earl of Thornfield. Helena first saw him on an April afternoon in the library. She had been sitting in the armchair by the window, absorbed in a volume of poetry the Countess had lent her, savouring this quiet hour before tea. The door opened so quietly she didn't notice at first. "Forgive me. I didn't realize anyone was here." The voice startled her. Helena looked up to find a tall man with dark hair slightly longer than current fashion dictated, wearing travel-stained clothes, observing her with what seemed like genuine curiosity, rather than the dismissive glance most gentlemen gave to companions. "Lord Thornfield, I presume." She rose quickly, setting aside the book. "I'm Helena Ravencrest, companion to the Countess. My apologies, I wasn't aware you would arrive today. I'll leave you to the library." She moved to pass him, but he raised a hand. "Please, don't leave on my account. The library is certainly large enough for 2 readers." He glanced at the book she'd set down. "What are you reading?" The question caught her off guard. Gentlemen didn't make conversation with companions. They nodded politely and moved on. They certainly didn't ask about reading material as if her answer actually mattered. "Wordsworth, my lord. Lyrical ballads." Something shifted in his expression, a spark of genuine interest. "Ah, lines written in early spring. One of my favorites, and much it grieved my heart to think what man has made of man." Helena blinked, genuinely surprised. "You know Wordsworth? I carried that very volume throughout my time in India. The pages are stained with dust and monsoon rain, but every word intact." His voice softened, taking on a quality she couldn't quite identify. "Poetry keeps your humanity alive when everything around you tries to strip it away." There was something in the way he said it, a raw vulnerability, an honesty without pretense, that bypassed all of Helena's carefully constructed defenses. They stood there talking as afternoon light shifted across the polished floors. They discussed poetry and philosophy, debated the merits of Wordsworth's romanticism against Pope's classicism, shared thoughts on books they'd loved and hated. Time seemed to slip away unnoticed until Helena suddenly realized the sun was setting and she was horrifyingly late. "My God, T, the Countess will... My aunt won't hold it against you. I'll explain that I detained you with questions about the library's organization." But when Helena finally arrived at the tea room, breathless and apologetic, the Countess looked at her with eyes that saw far too much. Margaret of Thornfield was nobody's fool. She recognized the signs of a conversation that had lasted too long and meant too much. "I trust you helped my nephew reacquaint himself with the library, Miss Ravencrest." "Yes, my lady. He was most gracious." The Countess took a deliberate sip of tea. "Nathaniel has always been too gracious for his own good, particularly with people who don't merit such attention." The barb was subtle but unmistakable. Helena lowered her eyes and offered no response. But the damage, or perhaps the seed, had already been planted, because Nathaniel began appearing in the library every afternoon after that, always at the same time, always with some plausible excuse about needing a specific book, about reorganizing the collection, about searching for old estate documents, and always, somehow, Helena was there. They talked about everything during those stolen hours, about the books that had shaped them, about the war. He told edited versions, stripped of the worst horrors, but honest enough that she understood how deeply it had marked him, about his childhood at Thornfield, running wild through the gardens with the older brother who had died of scarlet fever at 15. He was the favorite, Nathaniel said one afternoon, staring out the window at those same gardens. The perfect heir, groomed for the title from birth. I was just the spare, the insurance policy nobody expected to need. Then he died, and suddenly all the pressure, all the expectations, crashed down on me. I never felt ready for it. Still don't, if I'm honest. Is that why you went to India? He was quiet for a long moment, his fingers tracing the spine of a book without really seeing it. I went because there, nobody cared about my surname or what I was supposed to become. What mattered was whether I could make fair decisions under pressure, whether I could negotiate with dignity when cultures clashed, whether I had courage or cowardice in me when danger came calling. He turned to look at her. And for the first time in my life, I felt I had value for who I was, not for the blood I happened to be born with. Helena understood perfectly. She had spent her entire life defined by circumstances beyond her control, her father's death, her lack of fortune, her impossible position between worlds. And now you're back, about to step into that golden cage you spent 5 years escaping. Yes, the single word carried the weight of resignation, back to being the heir, the future Earl. The man whose every decision will be scrutinized and judged. She reached out without thinking and touched his hand. A brief gesture, entirely inappropriate, but utterly genuine. Not every cage has to be unbearable, my lord. Nathaniel looked down at where her hand had touched his, and something changed in his expression, something that made Helena's breath catch. No, Miss Ravencrest, I suppose not. 3 months passed this way. 3 months of encounters that both knew weren't coincidental. 3 months of conversations that crossed every line of propriety between a gentleman and a companion. And then came that afternoon by the lake that changed everything. It was late June, and with summer at its height. Flowers perfumed the elaborate gardens, bees hummed among the lavender, and the sun was warm without being oppressive. Helena was walking the lake path. One of her duties was to take daily constitutionals that the Countess believed promoted health and clear thinking when Nathaniel appeared from the direction of the stables. Miss Ravencrest. He fell into step beside her, as naturally as if they'd planned to meet. May I steal a few minutes of your time? She couldn't help but smile. You always steal my minutes, my lord. A few more won't make much difference. They walked in companionable silence until they reached the most secluded part of the grounds, where a small gazebo covered in wisteria offered shade and privacy at the water's edge. The lake stretched before them like polished glass, reflecting clouds and sky. Nathaniel stopped and turned to face her. Helena saw something in his expression that made her heart begin to race. Helena, he said her name softly, testing it. May I call you that just this once? She should refuse, should maintain the formalities, the barriers, the protections, but the word that emerged was simply, yes, Helena. He said it again, as if savoring it. These past 3 months, you've become the most important person in my life. I know I have no right to feel this way. I know our difference in station makes everything impossible, but I can't pretend indifference any longer. Helena's heart was pounding so hard, she could barely hear her own thoughts over the rushing in her ears. Nathaniel, I'm going to speak to my aunt tonight. I'm going to ask permission to court you officially. I know it's unconventional, I know society will talk, but I don't care. He stepped closer, close enough that she could see gold flecks in his dark eyes. I want you, Helena, as my wife, as my companion, as the person beside me for the rest of my life. Tears pricked at her eyes. Your aunt will never agree. I'm just a companion. I have no dowry, no family, no fortune to offer except everything that matters, he interrupted. Intelligence, kindness, strength that doesn't break even when the world tries its best to bend you, beauty that doesn't need jewels to shine. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. You make me want to be better than I am. And then he kissed her. It wasn't chaste or respectful or appropriate. It was the desperate kiss of a man who had spent 5 years surrounded by duty and death, who had finally found something that made him want to live fully. And Helena, who had spent her entire life being discreet, respectable, invisible, completely surrendered to it. What happened in that wisteria-covered gazebo, with the June sun warm on their skin and the lake whispering against the shore, was everything it shouldn't have been. Rushed, reckless, utterly improper. But it was also the first time in 24 years that Helena Ravencrest felt truly, completely alive. Afterward, when they had composed themselves, clothes disheveled but not obviously so, faces flushed but attributable to the summer heat, Nathaniel held her face between his hands with infinite gentleness. Tonight, he said, his voice steady with conviction, I'll speak to my aunt tonight. Tomorrow we'll be officially betrothed, and in 3 months, you'll be my wife. I promise you. Are you certain? Society will— Damn society. The words came out fierce. I survived fever in Calcutta and riots in Delhi. I won't let drawing-room gossip stop me from having the only truly good thing I've found in this world. Helena smiled through tears she hadn't realized were falling. Then yes to everything. They separated carefully, she returning to the house through the servants' entrance, he through the stables, maintaining appearances until Nathaniel could make everything proper and official. Helena floated through the rest of the afternoon. She helped the Countess with embroidery, read correspondence aloud, supervised arrangements for that evening's dinner. The Countess had invited local gentry, Viscount Hertford and his family, the Reverend and his daughter, 2 neighboring landowners with their wives. But Helena's heart was light as air. Her mind danced with images of the future, becoming Nathaniel's wife, perhaps having children, transforming Thornfield Estate into a home filled with warmth and laughter instead of just duty and reputation. She had no idea that while she dreamed, Someone else was plotting to destroy everything. Louisa Price was 42 years old and had spent the last 20 years at Thornfield Estate. She had arrived at 22, young, ambitious, determined to rise from scullery maid to a position of real authority. Through sheer competence and unwavering dedication, she had become head housekeeper. But she had also developed something far more dangerous than ambition, an obsession. She had watched Nathaniel grow from a grieving boy into a man. She had been there when his brother died, and he was consumed with guilt for being glad, just for a moment, that he would no longer live in that perfect shadow. She had packed his trunks when he left for India, crying silently because she loved him in a way that was completely hopeless and entirely inappropriate. For 20 years, Louisa had harbored a fantasy that somehow, impossibly, Nathaniel would see past the servant and recognize the woman who had devoted her entire life to his family. When he returned from India unmarried, that impossible hope rekindled itself with painful intensity. But then Helena arrived with her educated speech and gentle manner, and Nathaniel transformed before Louisa's eyes. She saw them in the library, heads too close over books. Heard Nathaniel laugh, truly laugh, at something Helena said. Watched them exchange looks when they thought no one was paying attention. And hatred took root in Louisa's heart like a poisonous vine. The final breaking point came on an afternoon in early June, 3 weeks before that fateful day by the lake. Louisa entered the Countess's private sitting room to collect embroidery and overheard a conversation between Margaret and Lady Hertford. "Helena is quite exceptional," the Countess was saying, her usually stern voice warm with approval. "Intelligent, well-mannered, of excellent character. If I had been blessed with a daughter, I would have wanted her to be exactly like Helena." Lady Hertford laughed softly. "Margaret, you're growing sentimental in your later years. Helena Ravencrest may be charming, but she remains merely a companion. Surely you're not thinking of seeing her well established." "And why not? Beauty and character are worth more than gold, Catherine. They always have been." Louisa's hands went numb. She dropped the embroidery basket. Both women turned to look at her. Louisa stammered apologies, retrieved the scattered items with trembling hands, and fled. But it was too late. She had heard. She understood. The Countess approved of Helena, was preparing society for something. And there was only one reason for Margaret of Thornfield, rigid and inflexible about propriety, to speak this way about a mere companion. Nathaniel was going to propose to Helena. It had to be that night, lying in her narrow bed in the servants' quarters, Louisa felt something inside her break beyond repair. Why Helena? What did the penniless orphan have that she didn't? They were both servants, really, both dependent on the Thornfield family for survival. Helena wasn't more beautiful, wasn't more capable, wasn't more devoted. She was just lucky, in the right place at the right time with the right man. And Louisa decided that if she couldn't have Nathaniel, Helena wouldn't either. The plan came to her gradually over the following weeks, each piece falling into place with terrible clarity. The ruby ring that had belonged to Nathaniel's late mother was kept in the safe in Margaret's study. But the Countess had a careless habit. She left the safe open during the day when dealing with correspondence and financial documents that were also stored there. Louisa memorized the routine with obsessive attention. Every Tuesday and Thursday morning, Margaret spent 2 hours in the study. The safe stood open. The door remained ajar. Housekeepers had legitimate access to that part of the house. No one would question her presence. And Helena carried everywhere a small leather-bound book of poetry, a gift from the Countess, treasured and kept close. The binding was old, slightly loose, creating small gaps between the pages and the cover. It would be absurdly easy to hide something inside that book. On Thursday, June 28, 1815, 3 hours before the dinner that would destroy everything, Louisa put her plan into motion. She entered the study while Margaret was overseeing dinner preparations. The safe stood open as always, its contents neatly organized. The ruby ring rested in its velvet box, an extraordinary piece, a pigeon blood ruby the size of a thumbnail, set in gold and surrounded by small diamonds. 5 generations of Thornfield women had worn it. Its financial value was immense, its sentimental value beyond measure. Louisa's hands shook as she picked up the box. This was the moment, the last chance to step back from the edge. But then she heard laughter drifting through the open window. Nathaniel and Helena in the garden below, their voices carrying joy and intimacy that cut Louisa like a blade. The last remnant of conscience died. She took the ring, concealed it in the folds of her skirt, closed the empty box back in the safe, and left the study with measured steps that betrayed nothing of the chaos inside her. No one saw her. No one suspected. Helena's room was on the second floor, modest but private, a privilege companions rarely enjoyed. The poetry book lay on the small table beside her bed, exactly where Helena always left it during work hours. Louisa opened it carefully. The loose binding created perfect hiding spots between the pages. She slipped the ring into one near the back, where it would be invisible unless someone specifically searched for it. She closed the book. The ring was completely hidden. Done. Now she only had to wait. Dinner was scheduled for 7 that evening. Important guests would attend: Viscount Hertford and his wife, the local reverend and his daughter, 2 neighboring landowners with their families. It would be the perfect setting for a scandal. Louisa went about her duties with perfect composure, her mind calculating every detail: how to make the discovery seem natural, how to ensure maximum witnesses. And then opportunity presented itself more perfectly than she could have orchestrated. The Countess, inspecting the dining room arrangements, suddenly turned to Louisa. "Fetch my ruby ring from the safe. I wish to wear it this evening." Louisa had to bite her cheek to keep from smiling. "Yes, my lady?" She climbed the stairs with measured steps, entered the study, opened the safe with hands that barely trembled. She lifted the velvet box, opened it with deliberate slowness. Empty. Her scream was perfectly calibrated, loud enough to carry throughout the house, shocked enough to sound genuine, but not so exaggerated as to seem false. "My lady! The ring! It's gone!" Within minutes, the entire household was in chaos. Margaret arrived at the study door, breathless and pale. "What do you mean, gone?" "The box is empty, my lady." Louisa held it out with shaking hands that were only partly theatrical. "The ring! Someone has taken it!" Margaret snatched the box, stared at the empty velvet interior as if willing the ring to reappear. "That's impossible. It's been there for decades. No one touches this safe except me." But the ring was undeniably missing. The Countess's face went from pale to nearly grey, her lips thinned to a hard line. When she spoke, her voice was dangerously calm, the quiet before a storm. "Summon everyone, immediately. Every servant, the companions, everyone in this house. I want them in the main hall now." 20 minutes later, the entire household stood assembled in the grand entrance hall. Helena had been in the gardens cutting roses for table arrangements. She arrived with dirt still on her hands and confusion in her eyes. Nathaniel stood near his aunt, his face grave with concern. The dinner guests had begun arriving and been ushered into a side parlour, bewildered but too polite to leave. "Was someone," Margaret began, her voice cutting through the nervous whispers like a knife, "has stolen an item of immense value from this house, the ruby ring that belonged to my late mother-in-law. It was in the safe this morning. Now it has vanished." Shocked murmurs rippled through the assembled servants. Helena felt her stomach drop. "A theft here. I am going to give the person responsible one opportunity for mercy," the Countess continued. "If the ring is returned within the next 2 hours, no legal action will be taken. The guilty party will be dismissed with references, but if it's discovered through other means..." She let the threat hang heavy in the air. No one moved. No one spoke. Margaret looked at the butler. "Search the rooms, all of them. Begin with the servants, quarters, and work your way up." Helena's hands went cold. She had nothing to hide, but the mere thought of having her belongings searched, of being suspected of theft, made her feel sick with humiliation. Nathaniel moved closer to her, his voice low. "Don't worry. They'll soon discover who did this, and all will be well." But Helena couldn't shake a terrible sense of foreboding. The search proceeded methodically. Servants were released one by one as their rooms yielded nothing suspicious. Nervous relief spread as person after person was cleared, until they reached Helena's room. The butler entered with Margaret and Nathaniel following as witnesses. The situation required authority and propriety. He began systematically, opening drawers, checking the wardrobe, examining every corner. Nothing. Then his eyes fell on the small poetry book resting on the bedside table. He picked it up almost casually, flipped through the pages without expecting to find anything. His hand stopped. His expression changed. "My lady." His voice was strange, tight. "There's something here." He carefully extracted a ruby ring from between the pages near the back of the book. It caught the lamplight, throwing red flashes across the walls. The silence was absolute. The butler opened the empty velvet box he'd carried with him. The ring fit perfectly, a match beyond any doubt. Margaret took a step backward, her hand pressed to her chest, shock and betrayal warring across her face. Nathaniel stood frozen, his eyes moving from the ring to Helena, from Helena to the ring, as if his mind couldn't process what he was seeing, and Helena felt the world tilt sideways. "No." The word came out as barely a whisper. "No, that's impossible. I didn't. I never—" Her voice rose, panic sharpening every syllable. "I never touched that ring. I don't know how it got there. Someone put it there. Someone is lying. Someone." Margaret's voice was dangerously soft. "Who, precisely? Louisa. Why would she do such a thing?" Helena looked wildly at Louisa, who stood in the doorway with her face perfectly arranged in an expression of shock and pity. No hint of triumph, no trace of guilt, just the face of a loyal servant, horrified by betrayal. "I don't know why," Helena said desperately, "but I swear to you on my father's grave and on everything I hold sacred, I didn't take that ring. Please, you must believe me." Margaret's expression hardened into something cold and unyielding. "Miss Ravencrest, do you have anything to say in your defense beyond denials? I'm telling the truth. The ring was planted. Someone is setting me up. The ring," Margaret said with terrible precision, "was found hidden in your personal book. A book you carry with you constantly. A book no one else would have reason to touch. The evidence is irrefutable." Helena turned desperately to Nathaniel. Surely he would defend her. Surely he knew her well enough to know she was incapable of this. But Nathaniel stood silent, his face a mask she couldn't read. And in his eyes, those eyes that had looked at her with such love mere hours ago, she saw something that destroyed her more completely than any accusation. Doubt. "Nathaniel," she whispered, her voice breaking, "please, you know me. You know I would never do this. Please say something." He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again as if forcing words past some immense barrier. "The ring was in your book, Helena. 5 words. That was all. Not a defense. Not even a question. Just a statement of fact that felt like a death sentence. You don't believe me." It wasn't a question. It was the sound of something inside her shattering beyond repair. Nathaniel looked away, unable to meet her eyes. "The evidence! Damn the evidence!" Helena's voice rose to nearly a shout, decorum abandoned in the face of complete devastation. "What about knowing me? What about the past 3 months? What about this afternoon when you promised—" She cut herself off, suddenly aware of all the ears listening, but it was too late. Margaret's eyes had sharpened with new understanding. "This afternoon." The Countess's voice could have frozen water. "What exactly happened this afternoon, Miss Ravencrest?" Helena couldn't answer, couldn't breathe, couldn't think past the roaring in her ears. Margaret looked between her and Nathaniel, reading the truth in their faces, in their silence. Her expression shifted from shock to something far worse, a cold, disgusted fury. "I see." 2 words laden with terrible comprehension. Not merely a thief, but a seducer as well. "How very thorough of you." "Aunt Margaret, that's not—" Nathaniel began, but the Countess cut him off with a gesture as sharp as a slap. "Not another word. You will explain yourself later. Privately." She turned back to Helena, and her voice became formal, final, utterly without mercy. "Miss Ravencrest, in light of this evidence and the circumstances surrounding it, you are dismissed from my service immediately, without references. You have 1 hour to pack your belongings and quit this house, and you may consider yourself fortunate that I don't summon the magistrates." "Please," Helena was begging now, all pride abandoned. Please, just listen. I said enough." The Countess rarely raised her voice, but she did now, the sound echoing off the walls. "I took you into my home. I treated you with kindness and respect. I trusted you, and this is how you repay that trust, by theft and deception." She gestured sharply to the butler. "See that she's escorted out. I don't want her in this house a moment longer than necessary." Helena looked one last time at Nathaniel, silently begging him to say something, do something, believe her, but he just stood there, his face turned away, his silence more damning than any accusation, and Helena understood with perfect, crushing clarity. She was completely alone. Helena packed in numb silence, her hands moving automatically while her mind remained frozen in shock. 1 small leather case, 3 mended dresses, worn undergarments, her grandmother's prayer book, nothing else of value because she owned nothing else. Her entire life fit into a single case. Louisa appeared in the doorway, ostensibly to help, but Helena saw the truth in her eyes now, saw it clearly, though far too late to matter. "It was you," Helena said quietly, without looking up from her packing. "You put the ring in my book. Prove it." Louisa's voice was barely a whisper, meant only for Helena's ears. There was no triumph in it, just cold, flat satisfaction. "Why? What did I ever do to you? You existed, simple, direct, devastating." That was enough. Helena wanted to scream, to rage, to tear the truth from Louisa's lying mouth and force everyone to hear it. But what would be the point? Who would believe the accused thief over the loyal housekeeper of 20 years? She finished packing in silence, each item another weight added to the crushing burden on her chest. When she descended the main staircase for the last time, carrying her pathetic case, the butler waited by the front door with an envelope. "The Countess instructed me to give you this. Your wages for the month." Helena took it with numb fingers. Inside would be perhaps £10. Enough for a week or two in some cheap boarding house while she searched for work. Work she would never find without references. The front door opened onto a night without stars, without moon, without any light to guide her path. Helena stepped through it and heard the door close behind her with a finality that echoed in her bones. She walked the dark road toward the village, her case growing heavier with each step, until her arms ached and her feet burned and tears finally began to fall. She didn't look back, couldn't bear to see the lights of Thornfield Estate growing smaller behind her, taking with them every dream she'd ever allowed herself to have. In a second-floor window, Nathaniel stood watching her retreating figure disappear into darkness. His hand was pressed against the cold glass. His face was a portrait of anguish, but he didn't move, didn't call out, didn't run after her, because doubt had planted its roots too deep, and cowardice had always been easier than courage. Helena reached the village as midnight bells tolled. She found a shabby boarding house and paid for one night's lodging with coins that felt like lead in her palm. The room was tiny, cold, smelling of mildew and old despair. The bed was lumpy, the blankets thin. Helena lay down fully clothed, clutching her case to her chest like a drowning person clutches debris, and finally, let herself break apart completely. She cried until she had no tears left, until her throat was raw and her chest ached and her eyes burned. She cried for her lost position, her destroyed reputation, her shattered heart. But most of all, she cried because the man she loved, the man who had promised her everything just hours ago, hadn't believed her when she needed him most. And that betrayal hurt more than all the rest combined. 3 weeks later, Helena sat on the edge of a sagging bed in an even worse boarding house in Manchester, her head in her hands, trying not to be sick again. 5th morning in a row, waking with violent nausea. 5th morning unable to keep down anything but weak tea and dry bread, and her monthly courses, which should have arrived 2 weeks ago, had not come. Helena wasn't naive. She'd been raised in a vicar's household, yes, but in the countryside where life's realities were impossible to ignore. She knew what these signs meant, but knowing didn't make the reality any less terrifying. Please, no, not this, not now. She tried to convince herself it was stress. The trauma of losing everything in a single night, the drastic change in circumstances, her body responding to emotional devastation. But deep in her bones, she knew the truth. That afternoon, Helena gathered what little courage she had remaining and sought out a doctor. Not one of the respectable physicians who would ask questions and demand references. She found Dr. Henshaw, an elderly man who practiced in the poorest quarters where people came when they had nowhere else to turn. "I need to know," she said without preamble, "if I'm with child." Dr. Henshaw examined her with professional detachment, asked clinical questions, made notes. Dr. Henshaw sat back with a heavy sigh that told Helena everything before he spoke. 3 weeks along, I'd estimate, perhaps 4 at the outside. The world stopped spinning. The air left her lungs. Helena had to grip the edge of the examination table to keep from collapsing. "Are you certain?" "As certain as medical science allows. Miss, the signs are unmistakable." Helena closed her eyes, fighting back the wave of panic that threatened to drown her. "And is there anything that can be done to—" Dr. Henshaw raised his hand, cutting her off. "Don't finish that sentence. I don't perform such procedures. And I strongly advise against seeking those who do. I've known 3 young women who died bleeding in back alleys because they tried to solve their problem with unqualified midwives. Helena's throat constricted. Then what am I supposed to do? Do you have family? Anyone who might help? No, no one. And the child's father? The bitter laugh that escaped her was more sob than sound. Yes, the father called me a thief and expelled me with nothing but the clothes on my back. I doubt he'd care to know. Dr. Henshaw looked at her for a long moment, with something that might have been pity. Then he wrote an address on a piece of paper. St. Mary's Home for Unwed Mothers. It's run by nuns. They take in women in your situation. You'd work there until the birth. They'd care for you through delivery, and afterward— He paused, clearly uncomfortable. Afterward, the children are typically given up for adoption to suitable families. Helena took the paper with trembling hands. And if I wanted to keep the baby? Then you'd need employment that accepts unmarried mothers, which is rare to the point of impossibility. You'd need lodging that permits children, equally rare. I'm not saying it can't be done, miss, only that it's extraordinarily difficult. Helena paid for the consultation with coins she could barely spare and left the surgery in a daze. She walked the streets of Manchester without direction or purpose, the paper with the orphanage address crumpled in her fist, her mind spinning through impossible scenarios. She could go to the nuns, work until the birth, give the child away, start over with a clean slate. It would be the sensible choice, the practical one. Perhaps the only one that offered any real chance of survival. But when she placed her hand over her still flat stomach, Helena felt something fierce and protective rise up inside her. This child hadn't asked to be conceived, hadn't asked for a father who was a coward or a mother whose life had been destroyed, but it existed. It was hers, the only family she had left in all the world. That night, alone in her miserable room, Helena made a decision. She would have this baby. She would raise it alone, whatever the cost. Not because it was right, not because it was easy, but because after having everything stripped away from her, reputation, home, love, future, this child was the one thing no one could steal. The months that followed were the hardest of Helena's life. She found work in a textile mill. The labor was brutal. 14 hours a day, 6 days a week, standing at loud looms in rooms with no ventilation, breathing air thick with cotton dust until your lungs burned, and you coughed blood into handkerchiefs you couldn't afford to replace. The pay was pitiful, barely enough to cover rent for a room she shared with 3 other women, and food sufficient to keep from starving. But Helena endured, because she had no choice. She hid the pregnancy as long as humanly possible, wore loose clothing, bound her growing belly with strips of fabric, worked even when morning sickness sent her vomiting in the alley during breaks. The other women noticed, but said nothing. In neighborhoods like this, where everyone had secrets they needed kept, there was an unspoken solidarity. Eat this. One of her roommates, Molly, pushed half her bread toward Helena one evening. You need it more than I do. I can't take— You can and you will. When I was pregnant with my second, nobody helped me. The baby was born weak and died 3 days later. Molly's voice was flat, telling an old pain, I won't watch that happen again if I can prevent it. Helena ate the bread and cried silent tears of gratitude. At 5 months, hiding became impossible. The mill supervisor called her aside at the end of a shift. You're with child? It wasn't a question. Helena lifted her chin, clinging to whatever dignity remained. I am. Married? Widowed. The lie came automatically, smoothly, born of necessity. The supervisor's laugh was cruel. Course you are. They all are. He looked her up and down with contempt. Can't have a pregnant woman on the floor. Makes the customers uncomfortable. You've got 2 weeks. Then you're done here. Helena wanted to beg, to plead, to fall to her knees and barter whatever she had left. But she swallowed her pride and simply nodded. I understand. 2 weeks later, she was unemployed. She tried every shop, every factory, every establishment that might hire. But no one wanted a visibly pregnant woman, widow or not. Doors closed in her face. Opportunities evaporated before she could even finish explaining. Desperate, Helena began taking in sewing work, mending, embroidery, alterations. Labor she could do sitting down, in her cramped room for pennies that barely kept her alive. She ate once a day, sometimes less. The small savings she'd managed to scrape together from her Thornfield wages vanished within weeks. Now she lived moment to moment, day to day, never knowing if tomorrow would bring work or starvation. Molly and the other women helped when they could. A crust of bread here, thin soup there, cast-off clothes that could be adapted for a baby. So why are you being kind to me? Helena asked one night, her voice breaking with exhaustion and emotion. Molly shrugged. Because we've all been there, love, or close enough. And in this world, if women don't look after each other, who will? At 8 months, Helena could barely walk. Her feet were so swollen she could no longer wear shoes. Her back ached constantly. The baby pressed against her lungs until every breath was an effort. She sat by the tiny window of her room, sewing by failing light, feeling the child move inside her, and whispered stories to the life she was bringing into an unforgiving world. "Your father was a good man once," she said softly, her hands resting on her belly. "Before everything fell apart, he was intelligent, kind. He survived terrible things in distant places. I hope you have his eyes, his strength, his capacity for love." She paused, tears sliding down her cheeks. "But I hope you have a braver heart, one that doesn't abandon people when believing becomes difficult." And then, on a cold March night in 1816, 9 months after that afternoon by the Thornfield Lake, the pains began. Helena was alone when labor started. Molly was working the night shift. The other women were gone as well. The contractions came like waves of agony, each one stealing her breath and her reason. She gripped the bed frame, trying not to scream, trying not to wake the entire boarding house. Finally, when the pain became unbearable, she staggered downstairs and pounded on the landlady's door. "The baby," she gasped. "It's coming." The landlady, a hard woman who rarely showed emotion, took one look at Helena's face and sprang into action. "My son! Fetch Mrs. Halloway from 2 streets over. Tell her it's urgent." She helped Helena into a back room, got her onto an old mattress. "Don't you dare die on me, girl. I won't have that on my conscience." The midwife arrived within the hour. Mrs. Halloway was a stout woman with capable hands and a brusque manner that somehow brought comfort. "Right then, let's see what we have here." The next 6 hours existed outside of time, pain beyond anything Helena had imagined, her body tearing itself apart, the midwife's voice cutting through the agony with short and sharp commands. "Breathe. Now push. Harder. Come on, girl. You're stronger than you think." Helena pushed, screamed, wept, bled, and finally, as dawn light began to creep through the grimy window, a sharp cry split the air. "It's a boy." Mrs. Halloway wrapped the infant in a clean cloth. Small but healthy. Good set of lungs on him. She placed the baby in Helena's arms. Helena looked down at the tiny, red, wrinkled creature and felt love so fierce it was almost painful. Dark hair plastered to a small skull, eyes that couldn't yet focus but seemed to look at her anyway, tiny fists waving in the air. "Oliver," she whispered, kissing his forehead with trembling lips. "Your name is Oliver. After your grandfather. You're going to be strong like him, kind like him. And you'll never doubt someone you love just because it's easier than believing." Oliver made a small sound and nestled against her chest, already searching for warmth and food and safety. And Helena, bleeding and exhausted and poorer than she'd ever been, made a silent vow. "I will protect you, I will raise you, I will give you everything I possibly can, even if it's not much. And one day, when you're old enough to understand, I'll tell you the truth about your father. Not sweet lies. The truth that he was good but not strong enough, that he loved but not enough, and that you deserve better." The years that followed were a relentless struggle for survival. Helena returned to sewing as soon as she could sit without agony. Oliver slept in a basket beside her while she worked from dawn until her eyes could no longer focus in the lamplight. When Oliver was 6 months old, she found work as a washerwoman. She carried him strapped to her back in a makeshift sling while she scrubbed other people's clothes in tubs of scalding water until her hands were raw and bleeding. The pay was slightly better, enough to rent a tiny room just for the 2 of them. No roommates, privacy at last. The room was barely large enough for a narrow bed they shared, 1 broken chair, and a window that didn't close properly. But it was theirs. Oliver grew despite everything. At 6 months, he smiled. At 8 months, he crawled. At 1 year, he took his first wobbly steps, and Helena cried with joy and heartbreak in equal measure. Nathaniel is missing all of this, she thought. The first smiles, the first steps, the first words, and part of her was glad. If he didn't want them, didn't believe in her, then he didn't deserve to know his son. When Oliver was 2D, Helena secured better employment as a housemaid in a respectable middle-class home. The mistress of the house had 5 children and desperately needed help. The position came with decent wages and, crucially, room and board. A tiny pantry converted into sleeping quarters for her and Oliver, but also 3 meals a day. For the first time since her expulsion from Thornfield, Helena went to bed with a full stomach. Oliver ate well. His cheeks became round and healthy instead of hollow. He laughed more, played with the other children, started learning his letters and numbers. Helena worked herself to exhaustion, cleaning, cooking, minding children, but Oliver was safe, fed, warm. It was enough. At 3 years old, Oliver was bright and endlessly curious. He asked questions about everything. "Mama, why don't I have a papa?" The question came one Sunday afternoon as they sat in the small garden behind the house. Oliver had been watching the oldest son playing with his father, being tossed in the air and caught safely, both laughing. Helena's heart clenched. She'd known this question would come eventually, had rehearsed various answers, but nothing prepared her for the actual moment. "You had a papa, Oliver, but he went away before you were born." "Why?" "Because he didn't believe me, because he was a coward, because he chose doubt over love." But she couldn't say that to a 3-year-old. "Because sometimes people leave, even when they shouldn't. But you have Mama, and Mama will never leave you." Oliver considered this with the seriousness only children can manage. Then he shrugged and went back to playing with his wooden soldiers, the question apparently satisfied for now. But Helena knew it would return, again and again, as Oliver grew older and understood more, and eventually she would have to tell him the truth. 5 years passed this way, 5 years of daily survival, of fierce love between mother and son, of building a life from ruins. Helena never looked at another man, never considered remarrying. Part of her was still trapped in that June afternoon by the Thornfield lake, in Nathaniel's arms, believing in promises that proved empty. But mostly, she simply had no energy left for anything beyond Oliver. At 29, Helena looked a decade older. Hard work and inadequate nutrition during pregnancy had left their marks. Lines around her eyes, grey strands in her dark hair, hands roughened and aged beyond their years. But when she looked at Oliver, healthy, curious, kind, she knew every sacrifice had been worth it. Thornfield Estate, June 1821. Louisa Price was dying, not from illness, from something worse, the slow poison of guilt that had consumed her over 6 years, eating away at her from the inside until there was almost nothing left. She was 48 years old, but looked ancient, gaunt, hollow-eyed, unable to sleep more than an hour or two before nightmares woke her screaming. Every night, Helena appeared in her dreams, pregnant, bleeding, holding a baby and asking one question over and over: why? Louisa had gotten what she wanted, hadn't she? She'd destroyed Helena, removed the rival, ensured Nathaniel would never marry that nobody companion. But Nathaniel had never looked at Louisa with anything but distant courtesy. He'd grown darker, colder, working himself to exhaustion managing the estates, refusing every marriage match his aunt attempted to arrange, and Louisa remained trapped at Thornfield with her guilt, watching the man she'd destroyed another woman for become a shell of himself. She couldn't bear it any longer. One morning, after another sleepless night, Louisa went to find the Countess in her private sitting room. "So, my lady," her voice came out hoarse from disuse and tears, "I need to tell you something about what happened 6 years ago, about Helena Ravencrest." Margaret looked up from her correspondence, sharp eyes noting Louisa's condition. "What about Miss Ravencrest?" "She didn't steal the ring." The words tumbled out in a rush, desperate to be free after years of imprisonment. "I did. I stole it and hid it in her book, because I was jealous. Because I thought if she was gone, perhaps Lord Nathaniel might. But it doesn't matter now, nothing matters, except that she was innocent. Completely innocent." The silence that followed was absolute. Then Margaret stood so abruptly her chair toppled backward. You're telling me you destroyed that young woman out of jealousy, out of some pathetic fantasy?" "Yes." Louisa was crying now, tears running unchecked down her hollow cheeks. "I know there's no forgiveness possible. I know I'll die carrying this sin, but I can't die without telling the truth. Helena was innocent, and I destroyed her." Margaret's face cycled through shock, horror, and finally a cold fury that was more frightening than rage. "And do you have any idea what you've done? That girl was alone, penniless, without references or reputation. She could be dead. She could have starved in some gutter, and it would be your fault." "I know," Louisa whispered. "I live with that knowledge every single day, and I'll die with it." "You'll do more than that." Margaret's voice was hard as granite. "You'll confess, publicly, to Lord Nathaniel, To the senior staff, to everyone who witnessed your accusations, the truth will be known. My lady, now, or I'll have you arrested for theft and perjury myself. Choose quickly. Louisa had no choice. She'd lost the right to choices 6 years ago. Within the hour, the household was assembled in the main drawing room. Nathaniel stood near his aunt, his face carefully neutral, though Helena could see tension in every line of his body. And there, trembling before them all, Louisa confessed everything. The jealousy, the theft, planting the ring in Helena's book, the lies maintained for 6 agonizing years. The silence in the room was deafening. Nathaniel stood perfectly still for a long moment, then his face crumpled, transformed by a grief so profound it was almost unbearable to witness. "No!" The word was barely audible. "No, that's not... It can't be." "I'm sorry, my lord," Louisa whispered. "So terribly sorry. But it's true. Miss Ravencrest was innocent. I destroyed her because I couldn't bear my own jealousy." Nathaniel's legs seemed to give out. He sank into the nearest chair, his head in his hands. 6 years. 6 years I've believed. What have I done? Oh God, what have I done? Margaret's own face was pale as death. "We both failed her, Nathaniel. We both condemned an innocent woman without proper investigation. We both share this guilt." Nathaniel looked up, his eyes red. "I have to find her. Now. Immediately. Hire the best investigators. I don't care what it costs. Find Helena Ravencrest. Please, I'll send for Mr. Preston in London," Margaret said, her own voice shaking. "He's known for finding people who've disappeared. If she can be found, he'll find her." They turned to Louisa, who still stood there like a spectre, waiting for judgment. "Get out," Nathaniel said quietly. "Pack your things and leave this estate. I never want to see your face again." Louisa nodded once and left, disappearing up the stairs. She was gone within an hour, carrying a small bag, leaving behind 2 decades of service and a destruction she could never undo. Mr. William Preston was indeed the best investigator in England, but even he took 2 months of painstaking work. He searched employment records, church registries, boarding house logs. He interviewed dozens of people, followed cold trails that led nowhere, spent Nathaniel's money without hesitation because he understood the urgency. Finally, in September 1821, he returned to Thornfield with news. "I found a woman matching her description, Helena Ravencrest, working as a housemaid for the Patterson family in Manchester. She has..." He paused, consulting his notes. "She has a son, approximately 5 years old, named Oliver." The words hit Nathaniel like a physical blow. He actually staggered, had to grip the desk for support. "A son?" His voice came out strangled. "Yes, my lord. Boy named Oliver. She lives with the employing family in modest quarters. A son. Helena had a son." Nathaniel's first reaction was visceral pain. She'd moved on, found another man, built a life without him, while he'd spent 6 years drowning in guilt and regret. But even so, he had to see her, had to beg forgiveness for what he'd done, had to try to make amends for the unforgivable. The next day, Nathaniel travelled to Manchester alone. Nathaniel arrived at the Patterson house on a grey September afternoon. He knocked at the servants' entrance. Somehow, going to the front door seemed wrong when he'd come to see Helena. Mrs. Patterson answered, confused by a gentleman at her back door. "I'm looking for Helena Ravencrest. I believe she works for you." "Helena?" "Yes, she does." Mrs. Patterson studied him suspiciously. "May I ask who's calling?" "An old friend from before. It's quite important that I speak with her." Something in his voice must have convinced her. "She's out back doing laundry. I'll fetch her." "May I go to her? I'd prefer to..." He couldn't finish, didn't know how to explain. Mrs. Patterson hesitated, then nodded. "Through the garden, past the kitchen. You'll see the wash house." Nathaniel followed her directions, his heart pounding so hard he felt dizzy, and then he saw her. Helena stood with her back to him, scrubbing clothes in a large tub. She was thinner than he remembered. Her dark hair, showing more grey than it should at her age, was pulled back in a simple knot. Her hands, visible even from this distance, were red and work-roughened. "Helena." She froze. The cloth she'd been scrubbing slipped back into the water. She turned slowly, as if moving through deep water. When their eyes met, Nathaniel saw everything he'd destroyed. The trust that had been shattered, the innocence that had been stolen, the life that should have been so different. Lord Thornfield. Her voice was ice, formal, dead. What an unexpected visit. Helena, I know the truth. Louisa confessed everything. You were innocent. You were always innocent, and I—" A child's voice cut through his words like a knife. "Mama, who's this man?" Nathaniel turned. A boy of about 5 years old emerged from the house, clutching a worn book, dark hair that curled slightly, grey-green eyes that were achingly, impossibly familiar. The face was like looking at old portraits of himself as a child. Nathaniel looked from the boy to Helena, from Helena to the boy. His mind struggled to process what his eyes were showing him. You have a son." "I do." Helena moved to place a protective hand on the boy's shoulder. "And he's none of your concern. He looks like—" Nathaniel couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't force the words past the constriction in his throat. "Like you." Helena's laugh was bitter, cutting. "Yes, Lord Thornfield. He looks like you. Because he is your son." The world tilted sideways. Everything went silent except for the rushing in Nathaniel's ears. "When?" The word came out as barely a whisper. 3 weeks after you expelled me like a criminal." The enormity of it crashed over him like a wave. She'd been pregnant, carrying his child, and he'd thrown her out with nothing, believing lies, condemning her to raise their son alone in poverty. "Why didn't you tell me?" Even as he asked, he knew how hollow it sounded. "Tell you." Helena's voice rose, all the pain and fury of 6 years erupting at once. "Tell the man who looked me in the eyes and called me a thief. Tell the man who heard me beg for his belief and turned away. Why on earth would I have told you about this child when you'd already shown me exactly how much your trust was worth?" Oliver looked between them, confusion clear on his young face. "Mama, what's happening?" "Go inside, sweetheart," Helena said, her voice gentling instantly for her son. "Ask Mrs. Patterson for some biscuits. I need to speak with this gentleman." "But now, Oliver, please." The boy obeyed reluctantly, casting one last suspicious glance at Nathaniel before disappearing into the house. As soon as they were alone, Nathaniel felt his legs give out. He collapsed to his knees right there in the yard, his carefully maintained composure shattering completely. "I'm sorry. God, Helena, I'm so sorry. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But you need to know. I've spent every single day of the past 6 years regretting what I did, hating myself for not believing you, wishing I could take it back. Your regret changes nothing." Her voice was hard, but he could hear the tears underneath. "It doesn't give back 6 years, doesn't erase what I went through, doesn't give Oliver the father he should have known from birth. I want to know him." The words came out desperate. "My son, Oliver. I want to be part of his life. Please. He's not your son, he's my son. You lost any right to him when you chose doubt over love. Helena, please. I was 3 weeks pregnant when you threw me out." Her voice cracked, and suddenly she was shouting, all the pain she'd buried for years erupting like a volcano. 3 weeks. I nearly died giving birth because I couldn't afford a decent doctor. He was born underweight because I spent my entire pregnancy malnourished, working 14-hour days just to survive. I've given everything, my body, my health, my life, to raise him alone. And now you want to waltz back in and claim him? How dare you? How dare you? Nathaniel stayed on his knees, tears running down his face, accepting her fury because he deserved every word. "You're right. You're absolutely right. I don't have any claim. I don't deserve any part of his life." He looked up at her. "But he deserves to know his father. He deserves to have someone who can give him opportunities, education, a future I can provide. He has a mother who's worth 10 fathers. I know that. You're extraordinary, Helena. You survived what would have destroyed most people. You raised our son against impossible odds. You're stronger than I'll ever be." He drew a shaky breath. "So, but that doesn't change the fact that Oliver deserves to know the truth, deserves to make his own choice about whether to know me." Helena stood frozen, trembling with emotion, clearly torn between protecting her son and giving him what Nathaniel was offering. Finally, she spoke. "1 visit, 1 hour, in my presence every moment. If he's uncomfortable, if he's frightened, if I see anything I don't like, you leave and never come back. Do you understand?" "Yes." "Thank you. God, thank you." "Oh, don't thank me. I'm doing this for Oliver, not for you, never for you." Nathaniel nodded, understanding it was all he deserved. Nathaniel didn't sleep that night. He lay awake in his hotel room, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing with thoughts of the son he never knew existed. What is he like? What makes him laugh? What frightens him? Does he like books the way I did at his age? 1,000 questions. No answers. Only the terrifying uncertainty of meeting his own child as a complete stranger. The next afternoon, at precisely 3 o'clock, Nathaniel knocked on the Pattersons' door again. Helena answered, her face carefully composed into a mask that revealed nothing. "Come in, quickly, I don't want questions." She led him to the tiny room she shared with Oliver. It was barely large enough for the narrow bed they clearly both slept in, a small dresser, one chair, and books stacked on the floor because there was no shelf. "This is where my son has grown up," Nathaniel thought, shame burning in his chest. In a space smaller than my dressing room, Oliver sat on the floor, drawing with charcoal on scraps of paper. He looked up when Nathaniel entered, curious, but not afraid. "Hello, Oliver." Nathaniel knelt down to be at the boy's eye level, not wanting to loom over him. "My name is Nathaniel. Your mother and I were friends a long time ago." Oliver tilted his head, studying Nathaniel with those unsettlingly familiar eyes. "Did you know my papa?" Nathaniel glanced quickly at Helena, who gave a tiny shake of her head. "Not yet." "No," Nathaniel said, the lie tasting bitter. "But I'm sure he would have been very proud of you." "Why?" "Because you're clever. Your mother tells me you can already read." Oliver brightened immediately. "I can. Mrs. Patterson teaches me with her children. Want to see?" He grabbed one of his smaller, worn books and began reading aloud. He stumbled over some of the harder words, but his comprehension was clearly excellent. Nathaniel listened, his heart breaking with each word. "This is my son, my son. And he doesn't know me." "That was wonderful," he said when Oliver finished. "You read better than many adults I know." Oliver beamed at the praise. "What are you drawing?" "Horses. I love horses. Mama says maybe when I'm bigger I can have one, but I've never even ridden one, only seen them from far away." An idea formed. "I have horses, several of them, actually, at my estate, far from here. If your mother permits, perhaps one day you could visit them." Oliver's eyes went wide with excitement. "Really? Mama, can I?" Helena hesitated, clearly torn. "Perhaps." But Oliver was already moving on, his attention caught by something else. "You have a scar. What happened?" He was pointing at a faded line on Nathaniel's temple, usually hidden by hair. "An old injury. From when I worked in distant places where sometimes things were dangerous. Like a soldier? Something like that. Tell me a story about the dangerous places." And so Nathaniel told carefully edited stories of India, adventures stripped of their darker elements, made suitable for a 5-year-old's ears. Oliver listened with rapt attention, asking 1,000 questions, his enthusiasm infectious. The hour passed far too quickly. When Helena finally said, "Oliver, Mr. Nathaniel needs to go now," the boy actually pouted. "But he hasn't finished the story about the tiger." "Perhaps another time," Nathaniel said, though his voice was rough with emotion. Oliver stood and, to Nathaniel's complete surprise, extended his small hand gravely. "You're nice. You can come back if you want." Nathaniel took that tiny hand in his own, feeling tears threatening. "I would like that very much." After Oliver had been sent to play outside, Helena walked Nathaniel to the door. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for giving me this chance. I did it for him. Remember that." "I know. But Helena, he's remarkable. Everything I could have hoped for. You've done an incredible job raising him alone." Something flickered across her face. Not quite forgiveness, but perhaps a tiny crack in her armor. "Buys my entire world," she said simply. "If you hurt him, if you disappoint him or break his heart, there will be no forgiveness. None. I understand. He's already lost 6 years with me. I won't waste another moment." Helena studied him for a long moment. "You can come back Saturday, same time. But Nathaniel, he still doesn't know you're his father, and I decide when or if that truth comes out." "Understood." Completely. As Nathaniel walked away from that modest house, his heart felt simultaneously lighter and heavier than it had in years. He had a son, a remarkable, bright, wonderful son, and he had missed 6 years of that boy's life because of his own cowardice. But if Helena would let him, he would spend every remaining day trying to be worthy of the chance she was giving him. Over the following months, Nathaniel visited every Saturday without fail. He always brought small gifts, nothing too expensive that Helena would refuse, but thoughtful things. A new book, good paper for drawing, pencils instead of charcoal. He played with Oliver, taught him things, told him stories, and gradually, imperceptibly, they built something that looked almost like a relationship. "He's smart like you," Nathaniel told Helena one afternoon, while Oliver was absorbed in a game of chess Nathaniel had taught him. "He's smart like himself," she corrected, but there was less ice in her voice than before. Something was shifting between them, slowly, carefully, like ice melting after a long winter. Nathaniel noticed how Helena began to relax during his visits, how she occasionally smiled at something Oliver said instead of maintaining her careful guard, how she started making tea for all three of them instead of just tolerating his presence. Small things, but significant. One Saturday in November, after Oliver had been sent on an errand, Helena spoke suddenly. "You've changed." Nathaniel looked up, surprised. "What? You're different from the man who—" She couldn't finish, but he understood. "How can you tell? We barely speak. I observe. I see how you are with Oliver. Patient, kind, never frustrated by his endless questions, never acting as if being here in this tiny room is beneath you. It's not beneath me. This room has the only thing that matters. My son." Helena was quiet for a moment. "Louisa, is she truly gone?" "Yes, dismissed without references. My aunt made certain of that. I should hate her. I do hate her for what she did, but I also—" Helena paused, searching for words. "I also pity her. What a miserable existence. To be eaten alive by jealousy for so many years." Nathaniel looked at this woman who had every right to be bitter and vengeful, who instead showed compassion even towards someone who'd destroyed her, and he fell in love with her all over again, deeper than before. December arrived with bitter cold and the first snow. Oliver had been watching for Nathaniel from the window all morning. When he finally appeared, the boy ran to the door with excitement. "You came, even in the snow." "I promised I would, didn't I?" Nathaniel brushed snow from his coat. "I always keep my promises to you." They spent the afternoon as usual, playing, talking, Nathaniel teaching Oliver new words, while Helena worked on mending in the corner. But then, that evening, everything changed. Oliver started coughing. At first, it seemed like nothing serious. Children caught colds all the time in winter. Helena made him tea, kept him warm, expected it to pass. But within 2 days, Oliver was burning with fever. His cough brought up blood. His breathing became labored and shallow. Helena knew these symptoms. She'd seen them before in the factory districts, pneumonia or worse, tuberculosis. Either one could kill a child in days. She tried everything she could afford: cold compresses, herbal teas, prayers whispered in the dark, while Oliver thrashed with fever, calling for her but not recognizing her when she answered. By the 3rd day, she was desperate enough to do something she'd sworn she never would. At 2 in the morning, she ran through the freezing streets to Nathaniel's hotel and pounded on his door. He answered in his nightshirt, confused by sleep, but came fully awake the moment he saw her face. "Helena, what?" "It's Oliver." Her voice broke completely. "He's sick, very sick. I need a doctor, but I don't have the money and he's getting worse and I don't know what to do." Nathaniel was already moving, grabbing clothes, pulling on boots. "Where is he?" "The Pattersons." "House, please, Nathaniel, he's—" "Show me. Now." They ran through the snow-covered streets together. When they reached Oliver's bedside, Nathaniel felt his heart stop. The boy was pale as death, his lips tinged blue, his breathing a terrible rasping sound that spoke of lungs filling with fluid. "How long has he been like this?" 3 days. I thought it would pass, but it only got worse." "Where's the nearest good doctor?" "In the city centre, but he charges £3 just to visit and I don't have—" "I'll get him. Stay with Oliver. Keep him warm. I'll be back within the hour." Nathaniel ran to wake the best physician in Manchester, Dr. Harrison, and practically threw money at him until the man agreed to come immediately. Dr. Harrison examined Oliver with professional efficiency, while Helena stood frozen with terror and Nathaniel paced like a caged animal. "Pneumonia," the doctor pronounced finally. "Severe. Another day without treatment and—" He didn't finish. He didn't need to. What does he need?" Nathaniel demanded. "Medicine, rest, careful monitoring, and someone with him constantly for at least a week. The fever has to break or—" Again, the unfinished sentence hung in the air. "I'll stay," Helena said immediately. "I'll be here every moment." "You work during the day," Nathaniel reminded her gently. "You can't be in 2 places at once. Then I'll quit." "No, I'll hire a nurse to help, someone who knows what they're doing. And I'll pay for everything, the medicine, the doctor visits, whatever he needs. Helena, please, let me do this, let me help my son." She wanted to refuse. He could see the pride warring with practicality, but when she looked at Oliver's laboring breath, her resistance crumbled. "All right." Nathaniel organized everything within hours. The best nurse in Manchester, hired to work in shifts, the finest medicines ordered. Dr. Harrison scheduled for daily visits. And then he stayed. He didn't return to his hotel. He remained in that tiny room, sleeping in the uncomfortable chair when Helena insisted he rest, waking at every sound Oliver made. For 48 hours, it was touch and go. Oliver's fever climbed so high he became delirious, calling for his mother, sometimes crying for his father, a father he didn't know he had. Helena never left his side. She held his hand, cooled his forehead, whispered stories and promises and pleas. And Nathaniel was there too, fetching water, helping hold Oliver when he needed medicine, doing all the things a father should do but had never been allowed to do before. On the second night, around 3 in the morning, Oliver's fever finally broke. He woke, weak but lucid, and saw both his mother and Nathaniel keeping vigil. "Out you stayed," he said to Nathaniel, his voice barely a whisper. "Of course I stayed. I'll always stay when you need me." Oliver looked between them, his young mind processing something. Then he said, with the devastating directness of children, "Are you my papa?" Helena's breath caught. Nathaniel looked at her, asking silent permission. She hesitated for a long moment. Then, slowly, she nodded. "Yes," Nathaniel said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm your father, Oliver." "Then why weren't you here before?" The question pierced Nathaniel like a blade. "Because I made terrible mistakes. I failed your mother when she needed me most, and because of that, I didn't know you existed until recently. But now that I know, I promise I'll never leave again, if you and your mother will let me stay." Oliver considered this with the seriousness only sick children can muster. Then he looked at Helena. "Can he stay, Mama?" Helena had tears streaming down her face. 6 years of anger, pain, and protective fury battling against something new and terrifying. Hope. "Do you want him to stay?" "Yes. He tells good stories, and he makes you smile sometimes." Those simple words broke something inside Helena. She realized her son had noticed her unhappiness all these years, had seen that she never smiled, never laughed, lived in a state of constant guardedness. "Then he can stay," she whispered. Oliver smiled, weak but genuine, and closed his eyes, falling into real sleep for the first time in days. Helena and Nathaniel remained on either side of the bed, their hands meeting over their son's sleeping form. "Thank you," Nathaniel said softly, "for giving me another chance, for letting me be his father." "Don't make me regret it," Helena replied, but there was less ice in her voice than before. "I won't. I swear it." 4 days later, Oliver was out of danger, still weak, still coughing occasionally, but clearly on the mend, and Nathaniel had not left. He'd remained at the Patterson house, sleeping in the chair, helping care for Oliver, becoming part of their small family in a way that felt both strange and somehow right. One evening, after Oliver had fallen asleep early, exhausted from the ordeal, Nathaniel asked Helena to walk with him in the garden. "Guys, I need to ask you something," he said once they were alone under a sky full of stars. Helena wrapped her shawl tighter against the cold. "What is it?" "Come with me, both of you, to Thornfield Estate." She went very still. "What?" "Come home with me. Marry me. Not out of obligation, not because of Oliver, though God knows he deserves so much more than I can give him here, but because—" He took her hands in his. "Because I still love you, Helena. I never stopped. Even when I believed the lies, some part of me knew they couldn't be true. I was just too much of a coward to listen to that part. Nathaniel, I know I don't deserve a second chance. I know what I did is unforgivable. But Oliver deserves a father. He deserves education, opportunities, a future where he doesn't have to struggle for every scrap. And you," his voice broke, "you deserve to never work yourself to exhaustion again. To never worry about money or food or whether your son will have shoes for winter." Helena pulled her hands away, wrapping her arms around herself. "And what does your aunt think of all this? The woman who threw me out as a thief. She knows the truth now. She's devastated by what happened. She wants to apologize to you personally, wants to meet Oliver, wants to try to make amends for what we did. And society. They'll call me a fortune hunter. They'll say I trapped you with a child born out of wedlock. They'll make Oliver's life miserable. Let them talk. I don't care anymore. I've spent 6 years caring about all the wrong things. I won't make that mistake again." Helena turned away from him, staring out at the frost-covered garden. "You're asking me to trust you again, to put Oliver's future, and mine, in your hands, after everything. I know, and I know I haven't earned that trust yet. but I'm asking for the chance to try. Not for a quick answer. Think about it. Take whatever time you need, but know this, whether you marry me or not, I want to be part of Oliver's life. I want to provide for him, help educate him, be his father in every way you'll allow. That doesn't depend on your answer to my proposal." Helena was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I need to think. This isn't just about me anymore. It's about Oliver. And I won't risk his heart being broken if you change your mind." "I won't change my mind. Test me. Put up every wall you can think of. I'll still be there on the other side, waiting, always. Give me time, as much as you need." 1 week later, Helena gave him her answer. They were sitting in the tiny room, now familiar to Nathaniel as his own chambers at Thornfield, while Oliver played with the toy soldiers Nathaniel had brought. "I've made a decision," Helena said quietly. Nathaniel's heart began to pound. "Yes, we'll come to Thornfield, but I have conditions." "Name them." "First, Oliver comes before everything else. Always. If at any point he's unhappy or uncomfortable, we leave. I don't care what society says." "Agreed." "Second, I need time before we marry. I need to see that you mean what you say, that this isn't guilt or obligation talking." "How much time?" 6 months. "We'll live at Thornfield as your guests. You caught me properly. Let me see who you are now, not who you were 6 years ago. And at the end of 6 months, I'll give you my final answer. And if the answer is no, then Oliver and I leave with your blessing and enough money to start fresh somewhere else. You can visit him, be his father, but I won't be forced to marry you." It was more than fair, more than he deserved. "Agreed." "What's the third condition?" "I want your aunt to apologize. To my face. Not because I want to humiliate her, but because I need to hear her acknowledge what was done to me, and I need to know she accepts Oliver as your heir." "She will, gladly. Anything else?" Helena took a deep breath. "Promise me that if you ever doubt me again, about anything, you'll come to me first. You'll ask me directly, instead of believing what others say. Because I can survive poverty, Nathaniel. I can survive hard work and society's scorn, but I can't survive being disbelieved by someone I love. Not again." Nathaniel took both her hands, holding them as if they were precious beyond measure. "I promise. On my life, on everything I hold sacred, I promise. Never again will I doubt you without cause. And even if I have cause, I'll come to you first. Always." Helena searched his face for a long moment. Then, finally, she nodded. "Then we'll come as we'll try. Thank you." The words were completely inadequate, but they were all he had. "Thank you for this chance." Oliver, who had been pretending not to listen but clearly hearing every word, looked up with shining eyes. "We're going to live with Papa. In a big house?" "Yes, sweetheart," Helena said, smiling through tears. "We're going to try something new." "Will there be horses?" Nathaniel laughed. The first real laugh in 6 years. "Yes, Oliver, there will be horses, as many as you want to ride." Oliver whooped with joy and ran to hug both of them at once, his small arms barely reaching around both their legs. And standing there, embracing their son together, Helena and Nathaniel felt something neither had expected. Hope. Real, fragile, but undeniable hope for a future that might actually be possible. The journey to Thornfield Estate took place on a bright October morning. Helena sat in Nathaniel's comfortable carriage, so different from the public coach she'd taken 6 years ago in the opposite direction, with Oliver pressed against the window, exclaiming over everything. "Mama, look at the trees. Look at those sheep. Is that the house?" "Is it?" But Helena was quiet, her hands twisted in her lap, anxiety building with each mile that brought them closer. "The last time I was here, I left in disgrace. Now I'm returning with the man's son. How will they look at me? What will they say?" Nathaniel, sitting across from them, seemed to read her thoughts. "It will be all right," he said softly. "I promise." "You can't promise that." "No, but I can promise I'll be beside you every moment. And if anyone treats you with anything less than respect, they'll answer to me." When Thornfield Estate finally came into view, Oliver gasped. "Mama, it's a castle." It certainly looked like one. 3 stories of grey stone, towers at each corner, hundreds of windows catching the afternoon sun, gardens that seemed to stretch forever. It was exactly as imposing as Helena remembered. And there, standing at the top of the entrance steps, was Countess Margaret. 6 years had aged her. Her hair was completely white now, her frame more stooped. But when she saw the carriage approaching, she stood as straight as her years would allow. The carriage stopped. Nathaniel descended first, then helped Oliver down, and finally offered his hand to Helena. She took it, letting him steady her as she stepped onto the gravel drive of the place that had once been her home and prison both. Margaret descended the steps slowly, leaning on a cane Helena didn't remember her using before. When she reached them, she looked first at Helena. For a long moment, neither woman spoke. Then Margaret did something Helena never expected. She sank to her knees right there on the gravel, in front of the servants assembled to greet their master's return, in front of everyone. "Forgive me," the Countess said, tears already streaming down her aged face. "Please, Helena, forgive me for what I did to you, for not believing you, for throwing you out when you were innocent, for the years of suffering I caused. I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'm begging for it nonetheless." Helena stood frozen, shocked beyond words. Oliver tugged at her skirt. "Mama, why is the old lady crying?" Helena knelt down beside Margaret, not to match her position, but to help her up. "Please, my lady, stand up. This isn't necessary." "It is. You deserve an apology on your knees. You deserve so much more than that." Helena helped the older woman to her feet, surprised by how frail she felt. "I accept your apology, not because what you did was acceptable, but because I'm tired of carrying anger. It's too heavy. I want to put it down." Margaret embraced her then, brief but genuine. "Thank you. You're far more gracious than I deserve." She pulled back and looked at Oliver, who was watching with wide, curious eyes. "And this must be Oliver. This is my son," Helena said, keeping a protective hand on his shoulder. "Oliver, this is Countess Margaret, your father's aunt." Oliver, with the resilience of children, stepped forward and made a creditable bow. "Pleased to meet you, ma'am." Margaret laughed through her tears. "So polite. And so like Nathaniel at that age." She looked at Nathaniel. "Bring them inside, show them their rooms, make them comfortable. This is their home now." The next 6 months unfolded in ways Helena never could have anticipated. At first, she and Oliver occupied a beautiful suite of rooms, sitting room, bedroom for her, smaller connecting room for Oliver, far more space than they'd had in years, but Helena insisted on staying close to her son. Nathaniel's rooms were in an entirely different wing. He kept his promise, courting her properly, with patience and respect, never pushing, never presuming. He took her walking in the gardens. They talked for hours in the library about books and ideas. He showed her how the estate was run, included her in decisions, asked her opinion on matters that actually mattered. "What do you think about Davies wanting to expand his dairy operation?" Nathaniel asked one morning over the estate ledgers. "I think we should let him, but provide a loan for the additional cows rather than a gift. He's proud. He'll want to pay his own way." That's exactly right. You understand these people better than I do." "I've been one of them," Helena said simply. "I know what it's like to need help but want to maintain dignity." Nathaniel implemented her suggestion, and Davies was indeed grateful for the loan rather than charity. Oliver, meanwhile, bloomed like a flower finally given proper soil and sunlight. He had his own pony, a gentle mare named Daisy. He had tutors who taught him properly. He had new clothes that fit, regular meals, his own room that he eventually agreed to use once he felt secure enough to sleep away from his mother. But the best part, he told Helena one evening, was having a father. "Papa taught me to ride today," he said, practically bouncing with excitement. "All by myself, Mama." He ran beside Daisy at first, but then he let go and I did it alone. Helena watched her son's joy and felt something inside her continue to soften. Nathaniel was keeping his promises, all of them. 4 months into their stay, something shifted fundamentally. Helena had woken with a nightmare, not uncommon, even now. She'd dreamed she was back in that Manchester factory, pregnant and terrified, with Oliver crying somewhere she couldn't reach him. Unable to sleep, she'd wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and gone to the library, seeking the comfort of books. She was surprised to find Nathaniel there, sitting by the dying fire with a book he clearly wasn't reading. "Can't sleep?" he asked when he saw her. "Bad dream. Want to talk about it?" She surprised herself by saying yes. They sat together on the sofa, maintaining careful distance, and Helena found herself talking about those years in ways she never had before. The fear, the exhaustion, the times she'd wanted to give up but couldn't, because Oliver needed her. Nathaniel listened without interruption, his face reflecting every bit of pain her words carried. "I'm so sorry," he said when she finally fell silent, "for all of it, for not being there, for being the reason you had to go through any of it. I know you are. I can see it in everything you do now." "Does that mean—" He hardly dared to ask. Does that mean you're starting to forgive me? Helena was quiet for a long time. Then she said, I think I'm starting to understand something. You made a terrible mistake, but you've spent 6 years becoming someone different, someone better, and that person, the one sitting here now, deserves a chance. Helena, she held up a hand. I'm not saying I've completely forgiven you yet. The wound is still there, but it's healing, and I think I'd like to see where this goes. Nathaniel reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and took her hand. She didn't pull away. They sat like that for a long time, hands clasped, watching the fire burn down to embers, both feeling something fragile but real growing between them. 5 months after arriving at Thornfield, Helena realized something that both terrified and exhilarated her. She was falling in love with Nathaniel again. Not the desperate, naive love of a 22-year-old who didn't understand how cruel the world could be. This was something different, deeper, built on understanding, on seeing each other's flaws and choosing to stay anyway. She saw how hard he worked to be a better man, how patient he was with Oliver, how he never took her presence for granted, always grateful for each moment she allowed him, and she also saw his struggles, the guilt that still haunted him, the fear that she would eventually decide he wasn't worth the risk and leave. One afternoon, walking through the gardens where everything had begun 6 years ago, Helena stopped at the gazebo. This is where it happened, she said quietly, where you proposed, where everything changed. Nathaniel stood beside her, his face reflecting painful memories. I've thought about that afternoon 1,000 times. Wished I could go back and do everything differently. Would you? Helena turned to face him. Would you really? Because if that day had been different, Oliver wouldn't exist. And despite everything I went through, I can't imagine a world without him. No, neither can I. He took her hands. Maybe everything happened the way it needed to. Horribly, painfully, but leading us to where we are now, to this moment. And where are we now, Nathaniel? I don't know, but I hope we're moving forward, together. Helena looked up at this man who had destroyed her and then spent years trying to piece her back together, who had given her a son she loved more than life itself, who was trying so hard to be worthy of a second chance. We have 3 weeks left in our 6-month agreement, she said. I know. I've been counting the days. And at the end of those 3 weeks, you'll ask me to marry you again. Yes, if you'll let me. Helena smiled, a real smile, the first he'd seen from her in 6 years. Then you should know my answer now, so you don't have to wait in suspense. Nathaniel's heart stopped. Helena, yes, she said simply. My answer is yes. I'll marry you. Not because Oliver needs a father. He already has one. Not because I need security, I'm strong enough to survive on my own, but because I choose you. Despite everything, because of everything, I choose us. Nathaniel pulled her into his arms, and this time she came willingly, naturally, as if she'd always belonged there. And when he kissed her, it tasted like forgiveness and new beginnings and promises that would actually be kept this time. They married in the spring, 7 years almost to the day after their afternoon in the gazebo. It was a small ceremony, nothing like the grand affair expected for the heir of Thornfield, just family and close friends, held in the estate's ancient chapel where generations of Thornfields had been married. Helena wore a simple gown of ivory silk, her dark hair adorned with fresh flowers from the garden, no diamonds or elaborate trappings. She didn't need them. Nathaniel stood at the altar in his finest clothes, his eyes never leaving her face as she walked down the aisle. And beside him, standing as his best man, was Oliver, now 6 years old, dressed in his own small suit, beaming with pride at being given such an important role. When Helena reached the altar, Oliver whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear, "You look beautiful, Mama." Laughter rippled through the small gathering, breaking the formal tension. The ceremony was simple but meaningful. When it came time for vows, Nathaniel spoke them with absolute conviction. I, Nathaniel, take you, Helena, to be my wife. I promise to believe in you, even when it's difficult, to stand beside you, even when the world stands against us, to be the man Oliver deserves as a father and you deserve as a husband, today and always. Helena's voice was steady as she spoke her own vows. I, Helena, take you, Nathaniel, knowing our path hasn't been easy. I promise to keep choosing us even when it's hard, to build a future worthy of our son and whatever other children we might have, to remember that forgiveness isn't forgetting, it's choosing love despite the scars. When the vicar pronounced them husband and wife, Oliver cheered so loudly that everyone laughed again. And when Nathaniel kissed his bride, sealing promises that this time would be kept, he tasted salt and realized she was crying. "Happy tears," she whispered against his lips. "I promise they're happy tears." 10 years later, at Thornfield Estate, Helena stood in the garden, watching as Oliver, now 16 and tall as his father, taught his younger siblings to ride. Caroline was 8, with her mother's dark eyes and stubborn determination. James was 6 and gentle and thoughtful like his father. Little Emma was 4, already showing signs of being the most headstrong of them all. "Higher, Ollie! Make the horse go higher," Emma demanded from her seat on the pony. "Horses don't go higher, Emma," Oliver said with the patient exasperation of an older brother. "That's not how it works." Helena smiled, her hand resting on her rounded belly, where a 5th child grew. This one, if Dr. Harrison was right, would arrive in summer. Arms slipped around her waist from behind. Nathaniel rested his chin on her shoulder, watching their children with contentment. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked quietly. "Choosing this life, choosing me after everything." Helena turned in his arms. At 37, she had laugh lines around her eyes and a few more grey hairs, but she was healthy, happy, surrounded by family and love. "I regret the pain," she said honestly. "I regret the years we lost. I regret that Oliver's first 5 years were so hard, but regret choosing you, choosing this." She gestured at their children, at the estate that had become a real home. "Never." "I love you," Nathaniel said, kissing her forehead. "Thank you for giving me another chance, for not giving up on us. Thank you for becoming someone worth a second chance." Oliver noticed them and rode closer, leaving his siblings to their lessons. "Are you two being disgustingly affectionate again?" "Probably," Helena said, laughing. "Is that a problem?" "Only when we have guests. Then it's embarrassing." But he was grinning, clearly not bothered at all. At 16, Oliver was becoming quite the young man. He planned to study law at Cambridge, following in his father's footsteps, but he also had his mother's compassion and sense of justice. "We're expanding the workers' cottages next month," he said, falling into step with his parents as they walked. "Father, I think we should include better ventilation and proper water access. The current designs are inadequate." Nathaniel raised an eyebrow. "We? Well, you're getting old. Someone needs to help manage the estate." Oliver's eyes twinkled with mischief. "Besides, Mother says if I'm going to inherit all this someday, I should learn now how to do it properly. Your mother is very wise. Always has been." They walked together in comfortable silence, watching the younger children play, surrounded by gardens that had witnessed both the worst and best moments of their lives. This wasn't a fairy tale ending. Their path had been too hard, too marked by real pain and consequences for that, but it was real. And it was theirs, built from ruins, yes, but stronger for having survived the breaking. And in the end, that was worth more than any perfect story could ever be. This story teaches us profound truths about forgiveness and second chances. Forgiveness isn't forgetting. Helena never forgot the pain of being called a thief, of being expelled while pregnant, of raising Oliver alone in poverty. Those scars remained, but she chose to forgive anyway. Not because Nathaniel asked for it, but because she saw genuine change, because he spent years proving he was different, because holding on to anger hurt her more than letting go. Nathaniel teaches us that apology without action is empty. He didn't just say sorry, he showed up, stayed present, respected boundaries, earned back trust inch by inch. And Oliver shows us that children deserve honesty. He grew up knowing his parents' story, the good and the bad. And that truth made him stronger, not weaker. Sometimes the coldest transactions hide the warmest hearts. Sometimes our worst mistakes lead us, eventually, to where we were meant to be. And sometimes forgiveness is possible, even when it seems impossible. But it requires courage, humility, time, and the willingness to become better than we were. Have you ever needed to forgive something that seemed unforgivable? Have you ever had to prove you'd truly changed? Leave your answer in the comments. And if this story moved you, please subscribe, leave a like, and share it with someone who needs to hear that second chances are real. Remember, forgiveness frees the one who forgives, and redemption begins with action, not just words. From our hearts to yours, thank you for spending this time with us. Until the next story. Empire of Heart Stories.